Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to preview Week 17 of the fantasy football season. It is, of course, championship week for most leagues, money week for most tournaments. That naturally magnifies every lineup decision that you're making in Week 17. Jared, I'd say maybe the most important thing, though, that you can do is to not change your process versus the rest of the season. What you've been doing to this point has worked. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't think about who you're starting this week. It doesn't mean to blindly start your studs, but I do think that it means you should try to limit the second guessing, because there is always going to be a decision that you can spend too much time on and ultimately overthink. It's tough, but you got to understand that sometimes it's just going to go wrong, even if it was the right choice. The easiest way to get yourself into trouble this week is to overthink those decisions, placing extra pressure because of the championship.
Yeah, congrats if you're watching this. I would assume that means you still have at least one, season-long team alive, and you're going for a championship this week. If you're going for a championship, I'm assuming you've made pretty good start-sit decisions all year to reach this spot. So, I wouldn't do anything differently. You're locked in. What you've been doing has been working, and just keep rolling with it.
Now, of course, there are decisions to make every week. Just because a guy worked for you last week or scored a bunch of points on your bench last week doesn't mean that you should necessarily put him in your lineup this week. And of course, we're still doing our normal process of projecting all these guys, filling out everything on the site that helps you set those lineups every week. Team Intel page is, of course, going. The rankings are up. We're going to keep that stuff updated, and we're going to run through some key decisions, some key players in the show to try to help make those decisions easier this week. Jared, that starts with CJ Stroud, and we missed him for the past 2 weeks for teams that he might have helped get to where they are. Now, it's entirely possible, because he was drafted so late this year, because he was on waiver wires for a while, that people have him plus a quarterback that allowed them to get through the 2 weeks that CJ Stroud missed. So now that Stroud's back, he's in a favorable matchup with Tennessee. What are we doing with him for Week 17?
I'm kind of like lukewarm on CJ Stroud this week. I think there's a lot of different factors at play here. Of course, you have Stroud coming off the concussion, and he's already missed 2 games with his concussion. He was limited in Wednesday's practice. D'Amico Ryans actually said Stroud's in stage 4 of the concussion protocol. There's 5 stages, so he's pretty close to being cleared. So it looks like he's going to play. We'll see what he does in practice these final 2 days. Not going to have Tank Dell, obviously. Nico Collins came back last week. He only played like 50% of the snaps, so he was obviously remained limited in Wednesday's practice. So we'll kind of see how he progresses. I'm at this point expecting Nico to be back to something close to a full go for this Sunday's game, but we'll keep an eye on that. The matchup is good for CJ Stroud. He's at home, so he's in the dome. Don't got to worry about weather for this game. He gets Tennessee, who is 25th in pass defense DVOA on the season. The Texans are implied for 24 points. That's 9th highest on the week. I'm not even sure yet if that's totally factoring in like CJ Stroud definitely playing. I could see that implied total even climbing once we get confirmation that Stroud is playing. So I think you're starting the obvious guys over CJ Stroud. Like you said, people, could have Justin Fields and CJ Stroud, or Lamar Jackson and CJ Stroud. I think you're definitely playing those types over Stroud. The one like fringier guy I think I'd play over Stroud this week would be Matt Stafford, who's just been, red hot. He gets a great matchup against the Giants this week. Otherwise, comparing Stroud to these other fringe quarterback one spot start types, I think I would roll with Stroud just because, he's had such a good rookie season. It's such a good matchup for him. It's a big game for Houston. They obviously, need this one to, keep their playoff hopes alive. So I would err towards Stroud if you're weighing him against those other options.
We've seen the ultimate upside for CJ Stroud this year, including, most notably that game against Tampa Bay where he put up enormous numbers. It's also, I think, important to note that he hasn't just been a lock for fantasy points every week. The past 3 games that he played, even throwing away the one that he left early, finished QB 14, QB 3, QB 15. So there have been a lot of weeks where he's down around the bottom of that QB 12 range and even just outside of it. So, again, a fully healthy CJ Stroud with everybody on the field, not a lock for big fantasy points. I think if he were at full health, if he had Tank Dell, he's probably like a top 5 guy in our rankings this week for this matchup, but those 2 things are not the case. Alex shared with us this week that Edwin Porras, who is at FB Injury Doc on Twitter, shared a study where he showed that quarterbacks have seen a dip in production in their return games from concussions. And it's one of those things that wouldn't necessarily seem obvious, because you think, if he's told that he can play again. A concussion's not the kind of thing where it should be limiting his play, like a knee or an ankle that might not be back to 100%. But a concussion is a brain injury. It makes sense that if you're just back from it, you might not be at peak decision making. And I mean, where does that decision making come more into play than at quarterback? So again, one of those non-obvious things that makes sense once you think about it. Stroud missed the past 2 weeks with a concussion. We have no idea just how close he is to normal functionality. We'll assume that he'll be all right. He is inside our top 12, but doesn't sit quite as high as I think he would at full health if Tank Dell were available. You mentioned Matthew Stafford. I think the other guy in that range is Baker Mayfield, where Stroud currently sits right behind Matthew Stafford and Baker Mayfield in our rankings. I feel a bit better about both of those guys because both Stafford and Mayfield are playing well coming into this week. They both have better sets of receivers than Stroud does, and there's no injury return challenge. So, can CJ Stroud outscore Baker Mayfield, Matthew Stafford this week? Sure, it's definitely possible. I feel a little bit better about those two guys, though.
Yeah, Stafford for me for sure. I think I would lean Stroud over Baker. I think Kyler Murray, who we can talk about here in a bit, is close as well. But again, that's the type of decisions I think you're making with CJ Stroud. I think anyone kind of below that tier, I would definitely start Stroud, and then again, I wouldn't be looking to start him over at one of these locked in top 6 or 7 quarterbacks.
And it's important to note here that Jared has an irrational hatred for Baker Mayfield. So you have to factor that into his assessment of Mayfield. So if you are reaching a bit below that, let's say you don't have Stafford or Baker or CJ Stroud available or any of the other guys that are higher than they are in our rankings right now, who would be your favorite guy in the spot starter category at quarterback this week?
Yeah, I like Kyler Murray this week. I thought his outing last week was maybe just his best, just from like a real life perspective since he's returned. Tough spot in Chicago against a good Bears defense. He finished quarterback 14 on the week in fantasy points last week. Kyler did. He's finished quarterback 14 or better now in 4 of his 6 games. He hasn't really had like a spike game, but he's had a pretty solid floor. A lot of that is because of the rushing. Kyler Murray's given you 20 plus rushing yards in 5 of his 6 games. He's gone over 30 rushing yards in 4 of his 6 games. So that's laid a nice floor. The passing's still kind of been spotty. Still probably not going to have Marquise Brown this week, which hurts, but he gets this Eagles defense. Over the last 5 weeks, Philly is 27th in defensive DVOA. They're 24th against the pass. They're 26th against the run. We saw Tommy DeVito have a crappy first half against them last week, but then Tyrod Taylor comes in the second half and puts up nice numbers. So it's just a matchup we've been attacking for a lot of the season now. And, the Cardinals are going to be playing from behind in this game. They should have elevated, both rushing and passing volume for Kyler. So I like him as a spot start. Again, I'd go with CJ Stroud over Kyler Murray, but like beyond Stroud, I think you're talking about, Baker and Kyler as the next 2 best like spot start options this week if you're, dealing with a quarterback injury.
I'd even be okay with, if you like Kyler Murray over CJ Stroud, I think it's close enough that that's a fine decision to make, especially with that matchup. Yep. If you are even more in the spot starter range of things, needing a quarterback, maybe you've been using guys like Geno Smith, Jake Browning, Nick Mullins, Joe Flacco in recent weeks. Joe Flacco's got a rough matchup tonight against the Jets. I think that Derek Carr makes plenty of sense this week. 3 touchdown passes in each of his past 2 games, sits 14th in our default quarterback rankings. So I'm not saying go out and grab Derek Carr to start over whoever got you here, but if you're in that range where you need help, it's a spot that makes sense for him. He's had 3 of his 4 best PFF single game passing grades for the season among the past 4 games. Finished QB5 last week against the Rams, finished QB9 against the Giants the week before that. Now, why I say don't reach too far, just before those 2 games, he finished QB 22, 18, 21. He had no other finish higher than QB 10 for the season before those past couple games. And he's had just 3 top 12 weeks among the first 10 games this season before their later season bye. Still QB 29 in fantasy points per game. So still a risky player, but if you are looking for a spot starter level, he's got a good matchup, does Derek Carr, against the Bucs this week, who are the league's number 2 pass funnel defense. If you look at our pass rate over expected numbers, which are on draftsharks.com, updated every Wednesday, you can check them out now if you want to see what your matchup looks like. The Bucs have faced the 4th most pass attempts in the league for the season, allowed the league's most passing yards, and they might even be without a couple of key passing game pieces on defense this week. Cornerback Carlton Davis has a concussion. Edge Shaq Barrett has a groin injury. So both of those guys missed practice Wednesday. We'll see about their availability. But even if both of them make it back, it's been an exploitable pass defense for Tampa Bay.
Yeah, his Bucs games have been pretty fun for a while now. We even saw it last week. Trevor Lawrence struggled for most of that game, but then CJ Beathard came in and put up some numbers. So it's definitely a Bucs team that, like you said, that teams go pass heavy against them, which kind of leads to shoot up potential in these games. So yeah, Carr, I don't trust the guy. I don't trust him to even make it through a game healthy. It seems like he leaves every third game with some injury, but it's definitely an upside spot for him.
Another guy that has proved through the years that we shouldn't trust him is Clyde Edwards-Helaire, but it sure looks like he's about to lead this Kansas City backfield in week 17 against Cincinnati, with Isaiah Pacheco suffering a concussion last week, with Jerick McKinnon already on IR. Jared, how much should we I guess trust isn't the word, but trust really is what we have to do with CEH this week.
Yeah, I mean, definitely not a must start Edwards-Helaire, but I think he's probably going to be, a RB2, maybe even RB3 or flex play for a lot of teams at this point of the season with the running back landscape. I mean, like you said, McKinnon on IR, we know he's out. Pacheco likely out. LaMichael Pirine is on the Chiefs active roster. They have a couple other scrubs on the practice squad, but I think Edwards-Helaire is going to get most of the work in this game. And it's really, to me, it's the matchup that makes him interesting. I mean, Edwards-Helaire he's not been good this year in limited chances. He's averaging just 3.3 yards per carry. He has broken off some long catch and runs over the last 3 weeks specifically. He has 20, 48, and 32 yard catches over the past 3 weeks. So that's kind of reminds you why the Chiefs actually took this guy in the first round a few years ago. But it's this Bengals defense that's 28th in run defense DVOA. They're allowing 4.5 yards per carry to running backs on the season. The Bengals have allowed a running back to score 15 plus PPR points in 5 of their last 7 games. One of the games they didn't was actually last week against the Steelers, and Najee Harris and Jalen Warren combined for 24 PPR points in those games. So it's just been an excellent matchup. And like Edwards-Helaire, again, he should get most of the backfield work for a Chiefs team that is, still implied for over 25 points this week. I know it's kind of tough to believe. I don't think they've reached that mark in a while, but I think in this matchup you could see something closer to the old Chiefs offense.
Their implied points for this week are at a number that they've only reached 5 times in 15 games this season. So I don't know if Vegas is overrating them or if I need to trust them more than I feel like I should. I will say that this version of the Chiefs offense is not as prepared to lean heavily on the pass as some past versions might have been, like last year even, or especially before that when Tyreek Hill was still around. We could count on these Chiefs going like 70% pass with such a depleted backfield and just a limited player left back there. But this version doesn't seem as ready to do that. Chiefs running backs rank 12th in PPR points per game for the position, but not with a lot of carries. 28th in RB carries for the season, 8th in running back receptions. You mentioned the long catches and runs for CEH lately. Nobody does screen passes better than Andy Reid. So that's certainly an upside area for CEH in this game. The team is tied for the second most running back touchdown catches. We know that throughout his still young career, Clyde Edwards-Helaire has struggled near the goal line. So that's a mark against him. But the Chiefs also like to throw the ball down there. He has been involved in that. He has 7 career touchdown catches from inside the 10-yard line, despite not playing well overall and being phased out of the offense. So you mentioned the implied points. Chiefs are 5th in that category this week, ahead of the Ravens and Rams. I think ultimately we've got CEH at RB16 in PPR right now. It's not a comfy spot, but I look at it, I'm not like, I definitely want these guys who are behind him ahead of him. There are some decisions to make in there. I'm not sure if I were looking at my own lineup and thinking CEH versus Raheem Mostert, I'm not sure that I could make that CEH choice right there. But I also can't argue that he doesn't belong ahead of Raheem Mostert, considering their 2 matchups this week.
Yeah, there are some names behind Edwards-Helaire for sure that would be uncomfortable sitting for CEH. I mean, to me, like I look at Zeke Elliott, I would definitely play CEH over Zeke Elliott. I would feel comfortable playing CEH over Derrick Henry this week against what's been a really good Houston run defense that just shut down Henry a couple weeks ago. So, I mean, those are the types we're talking about that I think, you could be benching for Edwards-Helaire this week.
Know that it's ultimately your decision. Just because our rankings say CEH is here and Raheem Mostert is here doesn't mean you have to do that. Make sure you're comfy with whatever decision you make for your lineup. But I think it makes sense given these scenarios. And, just since I brought up Raheem Mostert, he's been very touchdown dependent. Now, obviously, he's in an excellent offense for scoring those touchdowns, But if he doesn't score a touchdown, his week looks much worse, and they're playing Baltimore this week.
Exactly.
Stefon Diggs has, if you made it here, it's not because Stefon Diggs is on your team. You got here in spite of his recent production. He's lower than usual in our rankings this week. And Jared, I have a team that's in a championship, a money championship this week with Stefon Diggs that I've just kept in the lineup every week despite his recent lull in production. 14th in our PPR rankings this week. I think it's okay if you do have 3 guys higher than that ranking to sit Stefon Diggs, even though that's never going to feel good. But I can't push him down farther than that. I think this is one of those cases where I am going to lean toward start your stud as opposed to reaching too far for a replacement.
In 5 games under offensive coordinator Joe Brady, Diggs is averaging 4.6 catches and 40 yards per game. He's 48th among wide receivers in PPR points per game over that span. It hasn't been a target share problem. He has a 27% target share in those 5 games, which is really like about where he's been, maybe a tad lower, but pretty much, about where he's been as a Bill. The 2 problems are the Bills' pass volume is down under Brady, 32 attempts per game over the last 5 versus 35 attempts per game over the first 10. And especially the last 2 weeks, the Bills have thrown 15 and 21 passes over the last 2 weeks. That's kind of fluky. That's not going to happen again. If it is going to happen again, maybe it's in this spot against New England where they're massive favorites. But the thing I like about this Patriots matchup is they are a pass funnel. New England on the season is 2nd in run defense DVOA, 17th in pass defense DVOA, and they're 6th in pass rate over expected against. So at least while this game is close, it should be a game where the Bills lean back into the pass. Now, again, in the second half, if it's a 20-point game, it could be a lot of running. But I do think you're going to get at least more pass volume this week than you did the last 2 weeks. Again, Stefon Diggs is still dominating Bills targets. So I think, like you said, he's not a must start. I expect him to produce better than he has over these past few weeks, because I do think you're going to get more volume from the Bills on Sunday.
And the target volume has been down with that passing volume, but over those past 5 games that you mentioned where they have thrown the ball less, he's still seen 8+ targets in 4 of those. So it's been decent. The other thing that's working against him a bit is a shortened average target depth. Through week 7, Stefon Diggs had an ADOT of 11.3. Since week 8, that's just 7.4. Now, 4 yards shorter on your targets is pretty significant, and especially if you then couple that with less passing volume. But we don't want to overrate certain stretches. If we look at just last week's game, he had a 14.3 ADOT, which is one of his highest for a single game for the season. So any given game, that number can rebound. Josh Allen still has a strong arm. He still has Stefon Diggs as his number 1 target. Again, this is one that unless I have 3 guys ranked higher, and I talked about not reaching, but like Rashee Rice is one of the guys ranked higher. I think if you look at how he's been recently, there's nothing wrong with starting Rashee Rice over Stefon Diggs this week. That's one where if you look at the names, it seems like you're reaching, but based on how things have been going, there's nothing wrong with making that decision. But if you don't have 3 guys in our top 13, I'm sticking with Diggs. And if I lose because, Diggs gets outscored by KJ Osborn this week, I'm okay with that, as opposed to if I lose because I played KJ Osborn and Stefon Diggs had a Stefon Diggs game.
Yeah, well, on top of the ADOT being down, like you mentioned, Diggs has a 54% catch rate over the last 5 games. So, it's just weird how inefficient he's been with Josh Allen over the last 5 games. Now, we'll see where it goes, over the rest of the season and into the playoffs, because it's going to be a discussion heading into 2024. Is Diggs, has he kind of hit the wall? He is going to be 31, I think, this offseason. Fair to say he's definitely a declining player, but how big is that decline going to be? I think it's definitely something to watch over the rest of the season as we start to figure out where Diggs is going to slide into the 2024 rankings.
And it's not like some other receiver is moving ahead of him. Gabe Davis just had a big game, but has been mostly a 0 under Joe Brady. So I would say it behooves these Bills to get Stefon Diggs on track ahead of the playoffs. It would be a good idea for them to try to get him back in the right mindset, back productive, whatever. So there's reason to believe in Stefon Diggs still. Amari Cooper gave us reason to believe in him with an enormous game last week, Jared, but now he's got a Thursday night matchup against one of the league's toughest pass defenses, and he's got a heel issue. What are we doing with Amari Cooper for week 17?
Yeah, this is brutal to have Cooper on your team, and I'm sure if you started Cooper last week, you're definitely in your league's championship, but you might be benching Amari Cooper, which will probably feel horrible. But I mean, the heel injury is just on top of what is the toughest wide receiver matchup this season. The Jets are first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, and it's by a wide margin. The Jets are reducing wide receiver scoring by 40%. The next toughest defense is at 21%. So they are, basically twice as tough against wide receivers as any other defense. That's included number one wide receivers. The Jets have held number one wide receivers to 60 yards per game. That's seventh lowest in the NFL. Now they have allowed four games of 25 plus PPR points to some elite wide receivers. Steph Diggs, Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, and Jalen Waddle all went over 25 PPR points against the Jets, but only 6 other receivers have even reached double-digit PPR points against the Jets. So that's just 10 total receivers in 15 games now have reached double-digit PPR points against the Jets. The other interesting thing about this matchup tonight is we've talked about the Browns being super pass-heavy since Joe Flacco took over. The Jets are dead last in pass rate over expected against, meaning teams lean towards the run more against the Jets than any other defense. So we'll see exactly what that means for the Browns game plan tonight. But I'm expecting them to throw quite a bit less because of the matchup and because you have Amari Cooper dealing with this heel injury.
Yeah, and that heel is certainly worth bringing up. Like, we'll see. I would guess that he ends up being active, but it's an issue where we're getting reports like the Browns are going to see how he feels this morning and throughout the day. He's hopeful he's going to play, but it's up in the air. I mean, if we had fully healthy Amari Cooper, I'm probably just taking a shot on him against the Jets this week. But when we couple the matchup with that physical issue, he's sitting wide receiver 27 in our PPR ranks right now. And I think that's a totally fair spot for him. Like, there are a couple guys ahead of him where if you want to start Amari Cooper over Calvin Ridley, fine, no problem with that. But it's tough to move Amari Cooper up from where he is in those rankings, I think.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with where he is. Again, he's in a spot where he's definitely not a must start. There are teams where he's going to be one of your top 3 or 4 wide receivers. Because of the matchup and this injury, I would not be afraid to sit Amari Cooper if you do find, 3 guys significantly higher in the rankings.
I mentioned KJ Osborn in relation to Stefon Diggs. I think he's worth mentioning because he's one of those guys that could give us sneaky numbers this week, but he's not inside of wide receiver 3 range. What do you think of KJ Osborn for week 17?
Well, what I think about KJ Osborn is he's not very good, which is why he doesn't sit higher than he does. KJ Osborn's never topped 1.30 yards per route run in a season. This year he's at 1.07. That's 70th among 85 qualifiers. So that's the problem with KJ Osborn. The spot for him this week almost could not be better. You have TJ Hawkinson definitely out with his multi-ligament knee injury. Jordan Addison we're expecting to miss. Ian Rappaport called his ankle injury a week-to-week thing. He did not practice on Wednesday, so we're expecting him to miss. Hawkinson and Addison have combined for 14.8 targets per game. Now, some of that's come without Justin Jefferson, so I'm not saying they're leaving behind quite that much work, but there's a lot of targets up for grabs now against a Green Bay pass defense that is dead last in pass defense DVOA over the last 5 weeks. I've been looking at DVOA all season. Washington has been dead last over basically any span for, I'm pretty sure, every week I've looked this season. But this week, if you look over the last 5 weeks, the Green Bay Packers are the worst pass defense in the NFL. Over that span, over the last 5 weeks, they've allowed 9 wide receivers to score 14 plus PPR points again in 5 games. In 3 of those 5 games, you've had multiple wide receivers score 14 plus PPR points. So, Jefferson's going to get there. I feel pretty sure about that, but I think there's a chance that, Osborn kind of gets to that territory and, scores as a, wide receiver 3 for you.
And that defense will go without its lead corner once again, Jair Alexander, because they suspended him for basically being a doofus. So KJ Osborn sits 41st in our PPR ranks at wideout right now. I'd honestly, in my own lineup, probably play him over everybody between his current spot and like Tyler Lockett at wide receiver 28, just chasing that upside in an offense that has scored the 12th most wide receiver PPR points for the season. Even with Justin Jefferson playing in only 8 games, I think there will be plenty of targets available. I think it's tougher to project because we don't really know what the target share is going to be for KJ Osborn with these injuries, because we haven't faced this Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson being out. It'd be a little bit easier with Jefferson being out because we have more to go on there. KJ Osborn's not a lock. Brandon Powell has been involved as well. They can throw to the running backs. Maybe they run a little bit more, but I feel pretty good about the target outlook on Osborn this week and the productivity of that offense to this point.
Yeah, me too. I love the matchup again. Indoor game, plenty for both teams to play for. We don't even know who's playing quarterback for Minnesota yet, which is the other downside, right? Like Nick Mullins has kind of been all over the place, some good, some bad. So there's definitely some risk to KJ Osborn. But I mean, again, the spot as far as volume upside and matchup is as good as he can ask for.
I'll be curious to see the betting market lines on him and on Clyde Edwards-Helaire as we get later in the week. I don't think Osborn has a receiving line yet. I'm not sure whether I checked that one, though. Edwards-Helaire definitely didn't have a rushing line before we started this recording. So I think it'll be interesting to look at those numbers as we get deeper in the week and compare them to others in the same range of our rankings.
For sure.
Let's close this out like we usually do with defense. And Jared, assuming that somebody doesn't already have a high-end answer at the position this week, who's your favorite spot start on defense?
This is kind of a tricky week on defense, which is hopefully why, you've had a couple stashed over the last few weeks, kind of had one lined up for week 17. I think my two favorites among like defenses that are less than 50% started in leagues right now are both sides of this Falcons Bears game. These defenses over the last 5 weeks, the Bears are fourth in defensive DVOA, and we've talked about them a lot as just a defense that's been good in real life for most of the season now. Actually, Atlanta is up to 8th in defensive DVOA over the last 5 weeks, and both these teams are also top 10 fantasy defenses in most scoring systems over the last 5 weeks. The Bears had 4 straight top 6 finishes before finishing 19th last week. Atlanta, though, has finished top 10 in 3 of their last 5 games. They were actually 13th in another one. So they've had 4 pretty solid outings among their last 5. Both these offenses present upside to the opposing defenses, for different reasons. I do think that Fields is still a pretty good bet to take sacks and potentially turn the ball over. So I think it's going to be a pretty low scoring defensive battle, and I think both sides of this game will give you a pretty good fantasy production.
I'm a little bit more wary of the offensive upside on the Chicago side than I am on the Atlanta side. So I would pretty easily take the Bears if both of these defenses are available. I wrote up the Bears in the waiver article earlier this week, and they are still, as of Thursday morning, available in 73% of sleeper redraft leagues. So people aren't really on the Bears en masse at this point. They had a just meh fantasy week against the Cardinals last week, but it was a fine defensive performance. They allowed 16 points to Arizona in that game, 306 total yards, which is right at Arizona's average for the season. Before that game, the Bears had 14 takeaways over the previous 4 weeks. They've had improved sack production and just overall defensive performance since making the trade for Montez Sweat. Atlanta didn't work out as a matchup. If you played the Colts defense last week, it remains a high upside matchup, though, with Taylor Heineke at quarterback, plenty of turnover potential. And the Bears, like I said, have done well on the sack front since Sweat arrived. So I think there's a decent floor there, and I think the ceiling is high.
Yeah, and this game's in Chicago, too, which I think helps both defenses. If it was, indoors in Atlanta, I think there'd be more potential for the offenses. But I'd be surprised if, this game got over, 42, 43 points.
If the Bears aren't available, check the free agent finder to see the best options that are actually available in your league. Again, though, don't overthink it. If you have a defense that's ranked inside our top 8 right now, doesn't mean you go reaching for the best looking one on the waiver wire. Maybe you just play that one. We will keep everything updated throughout the week because we want to close this out and help you win your season.